The recording started. Welcome everybody to IP Tech Tuesday number 6. We're recording this part, discussion later we're not recording, and as always, I'm looking for volunteers to do the talking instead of me. Okay, so I don't know how many of you are familiar with the story of Lazarus, but basically he was sick and then he died and then he came back to life. This happens quite often to startup companies. Some of them actually die and some of them have a near-death experience. I actually have 2 companies in the last week that came to me with exactly this problem. Now, I'm one of the classic science fiction books is Rendezvous with Rama. And in this book, you have an interstellar spaceship. And as it gets closer to the sun, it starts waking up and comes back to life. And in medical device companies, often that's what happens, meaning they did everything, but they can't get money until they have FDA approval or until they have some clinical results, and the clinical testing can go on for 2 years or longer. So the company goes into some sort of hibernation, and then after a while, it suddenly wants to wake up. And in fact, it can also happen for other reasons. Now, what about the IP? So the company went into hibernation, the workers left or didn't leave. But if you think about the IP, any patent applications that they had in process published, some of the IP died. IP that was granted, often there wasn't enough money or management attention to make it match what the company needs. Usually they keep some IP alive, and it's very rare that new IP is filed. So you have companies going around that have IP which is 5, 6, 7 years old, and a dead space in the middle. So you have a company, it was in this freeze mode, and suddenly it woke up. The world probably changed. Now the question is, what do we do about IP? So here's some specific issues which I've unfortunately met in these situations. Sometimes your IP is so old that your competitor can simply copy your old design, or at least can figure out a new design. Or perhaps your company died when you didn't have enough money to file in many countries. So let's say you have a patent only in the US or only in Germany, but everywhere else, they can just copy what you're doing. Another issue is your insights, what's important and why you should be doing it. That's public. People can read it, they can learn from it. However, if your company hibernated, so it could be that people don't realize that these are important. Often your actual suggested product is out there. And again, they can just copy your product. In some cases, we can modify what the market or the clients believe is necessary in a product, and we can protect that modification. Big players. So why don't big players compete with little players? One reason is they don't want to take the risk. But there's much less risk. There's a design, there's clinical results, and instead of giving you an investment, they can just compete with you. So one of the things we have to ask ourselves is what can we do with the IP portfolio in order to increase the risk and uncertainty for a big player in order to make the big player prefer to pay you rather than copy you. I mentioned donut IP last time. Donut IP is when you describe a single invention and then you can't get protection for small variants because all of these small variants are obvious. Sometimes we're lucky and we didn't reveal or protect all sorts of critical problems, and then we can, of course, protect these critical problems. Sometimes your IP is obsolete or irrelevant. There could be a new technology out there which is much better than your IP. Let's say you wrote a patent and it was limited to using metal, and now they have plastics, which are good enough. Sometimes your IP is simply old and means now's the time to start mining for new inventions. And sometimes other people have actually been interested in what you're doing, and they've been publishing articles about it. They've been doing the R&D for you, and they've been publishing it. If you're unlucky, they published it only as scientific articles. If you're lucky, maybe they actually filed patents, and maybe you can buy these patents from them. So two ways of looking at it. The first way is, while you were sleeping, what happened in the market? So it could be that when you started hibernating, there was no market, and now there is a market. Market means there's people selling, your competitors. And then you got to ask yourself, what is your competitive advantage? If you don't have one, I don't know what you're doing. But if you do have one, we of course ask, can we protect this competitive advantage using IP? But now, because we have competitors, we have to ask ourselves, do we also know, do we have some sort of special knowledge or understanding that we can use to block the competitors? Blocking the competitors doesn't mean blocking them from using what you're doing, but blocking them from doing what they are doing. Because the competitors are entrenched in the market, and they don't need to give a good product in order to stay in the market. Sometimes there was a market before, and the market continued. How are you going to make up for lost time? Maybe the problems that you solved doesn't exist anymore. I had a company one day, the guy calls me up, I'm shutting down. Why are you shutting down? Well, I solved the problem, which is now solved using a different technology. There's no need for my company anymore. Just because the market continued, it doesn't really mean that the market stayed exactly the same. Maybe the market changed. Maybe you, with your historical knowledge, understand the new market better. In some cases, we're still in a blue ocean situation, meaning there's no competitors, nobody's doing it. And now the question is, how can we build an IP position in view of our own previous publications? And since time has passed, maybe we can better estimate what the competition might look like in the future. Okay, we're building an IP portfolio in order to block out competition. Maybe 5 years ago, you didn't know what the competition would look like, but today you have a better idea. And last but not least, maybe your competitors shut down or died at the same time you did, and maybe you can buy the IP, maybe you can obtain the know-how, or maybe you can just copy things that are not protected anymore and thereby build a better product or a cheaper product. So that was one way of looking at it, is looking at the market. The other way of looking at it is looking at your company. When did you start hibernating? And depending on when you started, there's different things you might want to consider. So let's say you built a proof of concept and then you started hibernating. That means that there's probably a lot of technological stuff which wasn't published yet and can probably be protected using patents. Maybe you already had a design freeze. Well, maybe the product can be improved. Maybe not all of the components exist. Maybe there are clinical directions. These are all things that you should be considering. Maybe you started hibernating while you were doing clinical studies. So perhaps some data or insights or even some anecdotes were not published yet, and these can all be good starting points. Okay, for example, you have clinical studies, but data regarding side effects didn't publish. Okay, we'll get a patent on how to avoid the side effects. What if you did everything except for having FDA approval or some other approval to sell and distribute? Then it could be that nobody really knows what the market is like, and we can get IP on how to match up the product or some other features to the market. And the worst case, maybe you already started selling the product and then went into hibernation. However, you still could have unique data, which could be the basis for good IP. For example, you know what people want to buy. You know what the next generation product should look like. You know what specific niches there are and how to get into them. If I have to summarize all of this, so here's some items you should be looking for when you get a company which was dead and came back to life. First of all, identification of critical problems or opportunities. Perhaps insight into a problem or solution. Clinical knowledge, this is very common. And by clinical, if we're talking about a non-medical system, let's say we're talking about microchips, clinical means how people will use your microchip in order to solve their problems and how to fit into the ecosystem. It doesn't have to be clinical in the sense of medical. Market understanding. Avoiding a supplier or client or distributor monopoly, and vice versa, creating a monopoly that only you can have a certain supplier or a certain client. You should definitely be looking at ingrained habits of the market or competitors, and hopefully you can take advantage of them. And of course, and when a good example perhaps is when you have a medical device. Doctors get used to doing something and they really don't want to change it. And if you can design your IP around that, you can get valuable IP, even though from a technological perspective, the delta is small. And we haven't asked, but you have to ask, why did the company come back to life? We want to protect that. Is there a particular competitive advantage? Why did the investors agree to give money suddenly? You have to look to see if the available technology or market or needs change. And of course, super important, and there's always stuff like this, there's things that you did not publish, even though you think that you did. And there's things that you did not understand, but that you do understand now. Okay, so these are all types of things that I think if you look at them when you're in the situation of a Lazarus company, it will give you a starting point on what the IP portfolio could look like. So like last time, I'm going to give you an example. This example, of course, is based on something real, except I changed everything. Imagine that you don't like certain foods. Let's say broccoli. There used to be a US president that famously said he didn't like broccoli. In the year 2010, you developed an ionic stimulator for the nasal cavities. Gases, plasma, you stick it up your nose, and some protocol, and it helps you reprogram your sense of smell. And in fact, you used it on yourself, of course, and now you like broccoli. You filed a patent, and the patent was granted in 2014. Okay, we're now in 2023. And it's directed at the device and how you use it. And you even showed the device in 2012, but you couldn't raise money. Nobody was interested. But luckily for you, COVID-19 happened, and some of you may not be aware, but many people who lost the sense of smell, when it came back, they had different preferences. Things they liked before, didn't like now, things that smelled bad, smelled good, and so on. So obviously, now there's a new market. The market is not people who don't like broccoli, but people whose sense of smell got scrambled and would like to fix it. And the question I'm asking is, what should be filed, when, and why? What are the risks? And what IP adjacent activities do you recommend? So I'm going to go now to the comments, and I'm going to stop the recording, and feel free to either make a suggestion for the tasteless situation, or share your experiences, or make a different comment on the presentation. I just would like to tell you that I've had, in medical devices, I've had more than one case where there was a big market and people were running into the market, and because of a very bad experimental result or safety problem, the market died, investors stopped putting in money, companies died left, right, and center, and then 5, 6, 7, 8 years later, somebody does a new experiment and people are willing to be interested again. So